Fire Emblem Engage was a wonderful celebration of the Fire Emblem franchise, and whether you're new to the series, started with Awakening, or have been playing since way back when, Engage may have introduced you to a bunch of Fire Emblem games that you haven't played before. Now that you're done with Engage, what should you play next? Well, I've played all the mainline games, and I think there's a lot to love about all of them, so I'm gonna go through each game and tell you why it might be a good choice for you to play. We're gonna start from the very beginning, but if there's a particular game you're interested in hearing about, you'll find timestamps for each game in the video description. Without further ado, let's start with the original Fire Emblem. This is where it all began, and I think it's a great choice to play if you're interested in the series' roots, particularly if you've already played a couple Fire Emblem games. It's really fun to see how many of the core mechanics and character archetypes we know and love today existed way back in 1990. Plus, you get a chance to see what the game was like without some of the mechanics we have today. I truly didn't appreciate how important battle preps and the ability to position units is until I played Fire Emblem 1 and didn't have it for a game. For a game released in 1990 though, it plays surprisingly well. You definitely feel its age due to things like a lack of range indicators, and the gameplay can be pretty slow. But if you've played a lot of Fire Emblem, you're gonna feel right at home with this game, and a lot of the maps have aged better than you would think as well. There are a few clunkers, but a lot of them are pretty good. The first chapter in particular is one of the better introduction chapters in the series. One note on the story of a lot of these older games, including this one, is that we didn't have support conversations as we know them until Fire Emblem 6, so a lot of characters don't get a lot of dialogue outside of their join conversation, and instead the story focuses on the main characters of the game, so in this case, Mark, Sita, and Jagan. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something to note if you're coming from the more modern entries that have more time for other characters to shine. I would recommend this game mostly to people that have already played a bit of Fire Emblem. There's something really fun about seeing the series' roots, and I think you appreciate it a bit more if you've played more of the series. Additionally, if you already know Fire Emblem pretty well, you'll have an easier time intuiting things like movement ranges, which is nice since this game doesn't have indicators for them. After Fire Emblem 1, we had Fire Emblem Gaiden, which really brought some experimental energy to the series. We got dungeons, multiple armies, an overworld map, tier 3 promotions, spell lists instead of tomes. These are all features that we would see again, but some not for many years, so there's a lot of historical value in trying this one. Gaiden is often thought of as the black sheep of the series, partially because of these new features, as well as because the maps aren't always the best quality. If you're like me, you're probably going to like some of the experimental features, like the tier 3 promotions or the multiple armies, and not like others like the dungeons. The 2 armies is one of the cooler features of Gaiden. You either follow Alm or Celica at any given time, which completely changes the units you have available to you, which helps keep the gameplay fresh in a game where the maps are not stellar. Whether you're leading your small rebellion in Alm's army or guiding Celica and her group, Gaiden feels less like a war story and more like a dramatic JRPG, which was kind of a refreshing change of pace compared to the games around it. When I was talking about FE1, I said that game will feel very familiar for longtime fans, but Gaiden brings some of the old school jank I was expecting when I went back to play the older game, so if you haven't played SOV, expect a bit of a different experience in this one. While I think I enjoy Gaiden's maps more than most, it has to be said that it is loaded with boats, deserts, and swamps that aren't particularly interesting to play through and often lack interesting terrain or are covered in terrain that makes maps less fun to play instead of more. I would mostly recommend Gaiden to people that really like Fire Emblem Echoes Shadow of Valentia. I thought it was really fun to see where the ideas from that game came from, and there were some significant changes to the story, as well as some smaller gameplay changes. So if you really like Alm and Celica, there's some more content for you here. After Gaiden, we return to Marth's story in Mystery of the Emblem. This game feels like a massive step towards modern Fire Emblem. We finally have range indicators, attack animations have map-appropriate backdrops instead of just a black screen, and the pixel art portraits are a lot more evocative than what came before. Since Mystery of the Emblem is a direct sequel, it's a blast seeing the glow-up each character has from the first game. Just look how dashing Agma is. Mystery of the Emblem is also jam-packed with content. If FE1 was a little too janky for you, this is a great game to play because it includes 2 campaigns. Book 1 is a retelling of the story of Fire Emblem 1, while Book 2 is a direct sequel to it. Mystery of the Emblem also added one of the first forms of major unit customization in the form of the Star Shards. These are items that you can have units hold to adjust their growths. For example, holding the Leo Shard gives a colossal plus 50% to your strength growth for the comparatively small cost of minus 10% to your defense. It's a lot of fun using the shards to make your ideal army, and if you're into the unit building aspects of more modern Fire Emblem games, This is the first game that has a lot of that. You'll also want to make sure that you collect all of the star shards in order to get the best ending. This is the first game I recommend as more than just a history lesson. It plays really well, it's visually appealing, and the star shards are a lot of fun to tinker with, even if you may have to look up what they actually do online. So this is a great entry point to older Fire Emblem games if you're not quite ready for the more clunky earlier entries. After Mystery of the Emblem, we have Genealogy of the Holy War, which is one of my favorites. Fire Emblem 4 is perhaps most known for its massive maps and quirky mechanics. My favorite of the mechanics is actually the inventory and gold management system. I made a whole video on that I'll link in the description, but the short of it is that everyone has their own golden items, so you have to think about where your items go, as you can't swap them around freely. This might sound annoying, but if you enjoy the planning aspect of Fire Emblem games, it's really fun. The large maps in Genealogy can be taxing at times, but they also really emulate the feel of a long-term military campaign in a way few other games in the series have managed. You can also save mid-map in Genealogy, so don't feel like you have to complete the massive maps in one go. Genealogy was also the first game in the series to feature child units, so if you enjoy the shipping aspect of games like Awakening and Fates, you get some of that here. To support this system, we also get to hear a bit more from each character than previous games in this one. There are loads of unit conversations and hidden events that give each unit a chance to get a little screen time. This gives you the chance to decide what characters you like and which one would pair well together. Or if you're more into optimization, you can look at what skills and items are passed down by each parent and build a bunch of super children. I would recommend Genealogy to someone looking for a bit of a different Fire Emblem game. It's got giant maps, a bigger focus on war and politics, and one of the most emotional scenes in the series. It's also a good game if you want a bit of a power fantasy, as Sigurd, one of the game's main characters, is one of the most powerful units in series history. I wouldn't recommend Genealogy if you're impatient. Maps are big, enemy phases can be long, and you'll be spending a lot of time watching animations play in the arena of each castle. I love this game, but it would be a lot tougher to play without emulator speed-up functions. Related to Genealogy of the Holy War is the next game, Thracia 776. Which is sort of a midquel, taking place during the story of Genealogy of the Holy War. You should definitely make sure you play Genealogy before this one, but boy oh boy are you in for a treat if you do. Thracia is one of my favorite Fire Emblem games, and it delivers on two fronts, telling a great story with one of the best protagonists in the series, and supporting that story with excellent gameplay. The first arc of this game is one of my all-time favorites, as we lead a small group of fighters being hunted by a larger force. This portion of the game is all about scrounging by with what you've got, and it heavily features my favorite map objective of all time, Escape All. With this objective, you have to get all of your units to the end of the map to escape, often while being chased by overwhelming enemies. This makes for some really unique maps that focus on things like movement or using staves instead of emphasizing combat. The Prison Break map in Thracia is one of my favorite in the series, and it's because it so heavily emphasizes movement instead of combat. There are still plenty of maps where combat is important, but these maps are a nice change of pace from the usual. Thracia also introduces a bunch of novel mechanics like capture, which lets you rescue defeated enemies and take their items, or thieves being able to steal items from enemies, including weapons, so you can take tomes from mages and laugh at them as they can't hit you. Your units can also be captured, which doesn't kill them, but can lose you some valuable items. Having escape objectives, a suite of new mechanics, and being more experimental with map design helps Thracia have some of the best story gameplay integration in the series, with a lot of the maps feeling like a perfect realization of what's happening in the plot. My only warning with Thracia is that it's a tricky game. There's a lot of missable items and characters, as well as maps with some mean tricks. In a lot of ways, these add to the atmosphere and experience, so going in blind is a lot of fun. But if those missables are gonna frustrate you too much, maybe check out a guide. There are lots of spoiler-free ones out there. Thracia is just full of quirks ranging from frustrating to genius, and it makes it one of my favorite Fire Emblem games to play. I would recommend it to pretty much anyone who's willing to get the translation patch and play Genealogy first. Next up, we're on to the last one that hasn't been released in the West for a bit. Fire Emblem The Binding Blade follows our boy Roy, and this game simplifies a lot from Thracia 776. It removes skills, capture, and the escape objective, and returns to a format that feels more like Fire Emblem 1, focusing on the Siege objective and Roy's coming of age as he leads his first army. Fire Emblem The Binding Blade feels super comfortable for me, having started playing during the GBA era, and I think they did a good job of removing some complexity while still delivering challenging and tactically interesting gameplay. It makes this game very approachable. The game boasts a beautiful pixel art presentation that has aged extremely well for a GBA game, particularly its combat animations, which are some of the best in the series. One of Binding Blade's most important contributions to Fire Emblem was support conversations. As units battle alongside each other, they unlock support conversations which allow you to peer more into the characters of the game. I love this feature as it lets me fall in love with side characters like Zealot without taking the focus off of Roy and the other main characters in the plot. It's a great way to provide additional characterization without bloating the main story, and it really makes it hurt whenever you have a character die. This game is the most challenging of the GBA Fire Emblems, so maybe start with one of the other two if you want to ease yourself in. But Fire Emblem The Binding Blade is a great pick if you love the GBA aesthetic and simplicity, but want a bit more challenge than the other two GBA games. After Binding Blade, we had its prequel, and first game to release in the West, Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade. Although this game is a prequel, don't worry about what order you play it and The Binding Blade in. They both make sense on their own, and playing one doesn't add that much to playing the other in my opinion. Blazing Blade is a great entry to GBA Fire Emblem, or Fire Emblem in general, because it begins with a fairly comprehensive 10-chapter tutorial to all of GBA Fire Emblem mechanics. And if you played the previous game, you're going to feel right at home as the core mechanics are largely the same. If you've played a lot of Fire Emblem, Blazing Blade's intro can be lengthy and kind of dull because you already know how to play, and it's not skippable the first time. In fact, you're going to have to play through the entire game just to unlock the harder difficulties. Despite this, Blazing Blade is a lot of fun, and it's significantly more forgiving than Fire Emblem The Binding Blade. If that game was a little too frustrating for your taste, this one is a lot more forgiving, and it boasts the same presentation, but with, in my opinion, a more lovable cast, even if the story can go off the rails at times. I would recommend Blazing Blade basically to the same people I recommend The Binding Blade to, just with the addendum that it's a little more approachable for new players and a bit more tedious for veterans. Blazing Blade is also a super commonly referenced game, both in the community and in more recent Fire Emblem games, so if you want to see where characters like Lyn and Hector originate, this is a game you want to play. The last GBA Fire Emblem game has a special place in my heart. Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones is the 8th game in the series, and it's my favorite one. It follows the sibling lords Erica and Ephraim as they fight to find out what has caused the formerly friendly country of Grotto to attack their neighbors. It's a pretty simple plot, but an incredibly earnest one, touching on themes such as jealousy and friendship. The game also sets itself apart from the aesthetic of previous GBA Fire Emblems with its heavy use of desert motifs. Sacred Stones is perhaps most known for its mid-game route split, where you choose one of the two lords to follow for 5 chapters of the game. This affects when you recruit certain characters and has some impact on how the story plays out. This is one of my favorite route splits in the series because both are very fun. Erica's route includes my favorite map in the game, while the overall quality of Ephraim's maps is very high. I also enjoy both versions of the story, and the brief length of the game and route splits means it's not too much of an ordeal to do 2 playthroughs and see both versions of the plot. Crucially though, both routes stand alone as complete stories, so you can just play one and have a complete experience. Sacred Stones also added a few neat features to GBA Fire Emblem. The first is trainee units. Sacred Stones added 3 units that start in a weak class but have an extra 10 levels and an extra promotion to grow through. They aren't the strongest units, but they're a blast to use. Additionally, each class has multiple promotion options. So an Armor Knight, for example, can promote into General or hop onto a horse by promoting to Great Knight. Most promotions have an obviously better choice, but the options make for more variety on subsequent playthroughs. Lastly, Sacred Stones has an overworld and a repeatable tower of enemies that players can use to grind, and a post-game that lets you recruit some of the villains that you couldn't play as in the base game. In addition to having accessible grinding, Sacred Stones is also the easiest GBA game to begin with, so if you want an easy entry point for older FE games, Sacred Stones is a good pick. It's also great if you want a game where you can kind of turn your brain off through some of it and focus more on the story and characters, and I think you'll enjoy doing that if you like Fire Emblem stories, as it's one of my favorite casts, and Erica is my favorite lord in the series. For veterans looking for a challenge, Sacred Stones may not be ideal, but its easy difficulty also makes it a fun choice for challenge runs like Iron Man's or 0% growths. For me though, the mechanics of Sacred Stones are fun enough that I don't mind the lack of difficulty. Breezing through this game for me is like Fire Emblem comfort food. The next games are Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, and I'm going to talk about them together because I really think you should play both if you're going to play one. Radiant Dawn is a direct sequel to Path of Radiance, and Path of Radiance leaves a number of plot threads to be tied off in Radiant Dawn. These two games have arguably the best story in the franchise, following Ike as he navigates the conflict between various nations as well as between shape-shifting Laguz and the non-shape-shifting Beork. While Ike's coming of age is enjoyable, the politics of Tellius and the conflict between Beork and Laguz are the most interesting parts of the game. The core mechanics for Tellius are similar to GBA Fire Emblem, with a few additions such as horses choosing a new weapon type on promotion or being able to shove units one space. The most important changes, though, are the flexible skill system that allows you to customize your units and the bonus EXP system. By completing certain side objectives in maps or finishing maps quickly, you can earn bonus experience that can be spent between battles to level up your units. This is a great way to add some urgency to each chapter, and it also allows you to level your favorite unit even if they come very underleveled or are less powerful than your other units. Another big change in Tellius is base conversations. Between battles, there are often a few conversations for you to read, which provide an opportunity for characters to give their feelings on the plot's events without interrupting the flow of the story. Some of these conversations are just to add flavor to the characters, but many also come with useful items, useful information for the next map, or even a recruitable character. While the core gameplay mechanics for Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn are similar, they set themselves apart by the way the game is structured. While Path of Radiance is very much like a traditional Fire Emblem game, Radiant Dawn follows multiple armies and your perspective bounces between them on a chapter-by-chapter basis. So in Radiant Dawn, you could be controlling Ike's mercenary company in one chapter, and Micaiah's Dawn Brigade in the next. You'll be using completely different soldiers in each chapter, and you might even be fighting some of your favorites from the other armies. Radiant Dawn also incorporates some truly massive maps loaded with enemies. The large-scale maps and bouncing between different armies' perspectives helps Radiant Dawn evoke the feelings of war better than some of the other games in the series, which meshes well with its themes of conflict and what conflict's cost is to the world. Tellius is a great pair of games to jump into if you're in the mood for a Fire Emblem game with a strong, epic-feeling story and a great world. Make sure you're prepared to play through some big maps with slow enemy phases though, as the larger maps in Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn can take a long time to get through. If you can look past that though, these are a great pair of games to play. After Tellius, we move to the DS for Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and New Mystery of the Emblem. I'm going to talk about these two games together as well since they're remakes of Fire Emblem 1 and 3, meaning New Mystery is a sequel to the events of Shadow Dragon. Notably, New Mystery of the Emblem never released in the West, but it's the last game on this list that you'll need a fan translation of if you don't speak Japanese. Shadow Dragon feels like a return to the design sensibilities of Fire Emblem 1, which makes sense since it's a remake, but with some new features that make it more fun to play than the original. Writing-wise, we're back to the original storytelling style of focusing on just the main characters, with side characters having little development outside their joined dialogue, but fortunately the story in Shadow Dragon is good. I really enjoyed reading Marth's tale, but if you're more interested in a fleshed-out cast, Shadow Dragon is missing that. Gameplay-wise, Shadow Dragon's maps are reasonably faithful to the original, but some new features change how you interact with them. First, this is the first game to have reclassing. Units have a number of class options they can change into at any time at almost no cost. So if you decide you want an extra flyer for a map, you can switch Jagan onto Wyvern for a chapter and then change him back if the next chapter is heavy on archers. Additionally, this game has a forge system that allows you to upgrade weapons. This lets you do things like make a forged wing spear that dominates enemies until it breaks. These features can really change how the maps play out, because you can have more flyers, or more cavs, or a bunch of archers, or a bunch of mages if you want. And this provides a lot of replay value since you can try to figure out everyone's optimal class for each chapter, or you can try units and goofy classes for more of a silly run. Shadow Dragon supports both playstyles very well by offering a multitude of difficulties ranging from normal to hard 5. So if you ever want to work your way up the difficulty ladder, Shadow Dragon can ease you into its hardest difficulty, which I found to be one of the most rewarding in the series. New Mystery of the Emblem utilizes similar mechanics to Shadow Dragon but adds a few important features. First, this is where casual mode came from. In casual mode, when units die, they come back the next chapter instead of being dead for good. Second, this is also where we got our first avatar unit. The story begins with a tutorial following our avatar Chris, and they're a relevant side character for most of the game, and a primary character during the new side story of New Mystery of the Emblem. I don't love Chris's impact on the main story of New Mystery, but I thought the side story was a lot of fun, and the mechanics from Shadow Dragon are still fun here. New Mystery also added base conversations, which basically function as supports in this game, so there's more opportunity to dive into the character of each member of your army in New Mystery. I would recommend these games to anyone that loves the tactics gameplay of Fire Emblem. Shadow Dragon and New Mystery strip away a lot of mechanics like skills and rescue to create really fun and challenging fundamental Fire Emblem gameplay. And if that sounds appealing to you, then these games are great choices. After we didn't get New Mystery in the West, I wasn't sure we were ever going to get a Fire Emblem again, so I was overjoyed when we got Fire Emblem Awakening. Awakening on the 3DS was almost the polar opposite of Shadow Dragon and New Mystery. While those games focused on simplicity and stripped away a lot of mechanics, Awakening added a lot of new things. The biggest was the pair-up system. Units in Awakening could join onto one square and fight together, sort of like rescuing in previous Fire Emblem games, but in those games rescuing meant combat penalties for the carrier. In this game, pairing up is a combat boost. The main unit enjoys a stat boost as well as a chance for their pair-up partner to assist them in combat or defend them. Pair-up totally shapes the way you play every map, but the game also includes a flexible reclassing and skill system, so there are tons of ways to customize units, and you can make some incredibly powerful juggernauts with the right setup. Awakening also reintroduced marriage as a mechanic to the series. As you earn supports between characters, you can decide which ones should marry. The decision has mechanical implications too, because each married couple will produce a child unit that inherits class options and skills from their parents. So if you're into making the best units possible, there's a ton to think about with child units. Or if you don't care so much about optimizing, you can just pair up units by who you think would make the best couple. The mechanics in Awakening aren't the most well balanced, and the maps aren't the most challenging, but if you enjoy building up units, there's a lot of fun to be had here. Awakening is very forgiving on its lower difficulties, which makes it a great introduction to the 3DS era of Fire Emblem games. And I would recommend it to anyone that likes the idea of playing matchmaker with their units, or who likes being able to customize their units in order to break the game. After Awakening we have Fates, and it's a bit of a weird one because it's actually 3 games. Fates follows Corrin, a main character torn between the family that raised them and the family they were born into. You side with either the Kingdom of Nor in Fate's Conquest, or Hoshido in Fate's Birthright, and then there's a third route called Fate's Revelations, but if you want to play that one, you should save it for after the other two, as it kind of assumes that you played the other two first. While the games differ a lot in map design and difficulty, the core mechanics are the same in all 3, and it's very much an iteration on Awakening. Pair-up is back, but it's way more balanced this time around. Unpaired units next to each other attack together, while units paired with each other provide a stat boost and can block an attack for their ally. This means you don't just want to be always paired up in Fates, there are benefits to being unpaired at times. Like Awakening, characters in Fates can learn a variety of skills by progressing through different classes, but you'll have to plan carefully to get all the classes and skills that you want. Reclassing is interesting here because not every unit has access to every class, but they can gain access to more classes through supports. For example, Evie can gain access to Archer by supporting Mozu. The result is that to make the best units, you need to do a fair amount of planning. You have to decide what skills you want, which will determine what classes you want to go into, which will determine what support pairings you want to do. It's a lot of planning, and if you don't like doing a lot of planning, that might not appeal to you. But watching the plan pay off as your units start to get all of the exciting skills you planned for them is a blast, and making sure that you hit those support requirements in a timely manner is an interesting challenge that doesn't really exist in other Fire Emblem games as much. Each route of Fates is very different in terms of how they play. Birthright feels a lot like Awakening, it's a more forgiving game and includes a lot of route maps, whereas Conquest is a more difficult game with a lot of tricky maps and a variety of objectives. Revelations is a bit of an oddball of a game, but its big plus is that you can recruit most of the characters in this one, so if you enjoy customizing units and making the best possible child units, there's a lot to tinker with in Revelations. I would recommend Birthright mostly to people that liked Awakening and want a similar gameplay experience, Conquest to people looking for a game that challenges them to make the best use of a set of complex mechanics, and Revelations to people that enjoy both Birthright and Conquest or like the unit customization. Notably, the story in Fates is on the weaker side, but the gameplay is really fun, especially in Conquest, so if you're mostly into the games for the story, it's probably safe to skip Fates, but if you're more into the gameplay or if you like both, Fates is a great game to try, especially Conquest. Our last 3DS game is Fire Emblem Echoes: Shadows of Valentia. It's a remake of Fire Emblem Gaiden, and surprisingly faithful. Much like the original Gaiden, SOV follows 2 armies led by Alm and Celica, and includes most of the original dungeons, overworld, and maps. Where SOV does make some changes is in the writing and presentation. Writing-wise, SOV makes a few revisions and additions to the original script. The changes are a mixed bag. There are a few notable moments that got cut from the original Gaiden, including a dramatic moment towards the end of Alm's route that I really enjoy. However, there are also some nice additions, including a new antagonist, Berku. Regardless of which story you prefer though, I found Echo's story to be one of the stronger ones in the series, and the romance between Alm and Celica is very cute. SOV also added supports. There aren't a ton, and they're mostly pretty short, but it does provide an opportunity to learn more about SOV's cast, so there's more opportunity to have a favorite side character in SOV than there was in Gaiden. SOV's biggest gameplay contribution is combat arts. Weapons in SOV had special attacks they could perform at the cost of some of the attacker's health. For example, the Wind Sweep combat art costs 4 health, but prevents the enemy from counterattacking. This made weapon selection interesting and added an extra wrinkle to the gameplay that wasn't present in the original Gaiden. The best part about Shadows of Valentia, though, is its presentation. The game boasts some of the best art in the series, along with one of the best soundtracks. Even when Echo's gameplay falters, it's always a treat to look at and listen to. Shadows of Valentia is a great choice if you're in the mood for a romance story. It tells a very sweet one, and the beautiful cutscenes add a lot to the impact of the story. Gameplay-wise, SOV is an odd duck. I would recommend it if you're interested in something a little different than other Fire Emblem games, because there's not much quite like it. If you want a Fire Emblem experience that's more like the rest of the series, though, I might try other games first. Our first Fire Emblem on the Switch was Fire Emblem Three Houses, and the highest praise I can give Three Houses is that it lived in my brain for about a year after it came out. Three Houses shifts some of the focus away from the tactics gameplay of Fire Emblem in favor of focusing on the school setting, the development of character relationships, and the world of Fodlan. While the tactics gameplay is of course still there, Three Houses is most fun for people that are more interested in character writing and unit building. Unlike most Fire Emblem games where you recruit progressively stronger allies for most of the game, Three Houses focuses on building up a bunch of wimpy students to become battle ready. If you like using the trainee units in other Fire Emblem games, this might be something you enjoy. The nature of building units up from the ground also means that they're highly customizable. You can get almost any unit doing whatever you want, and the game is very forgiving on normal and hard mode, so you can experiment to your heart's content. Combat arts also return from Shadows of Valentia in this game, though this time they cost weapon durability instead of HP. The big new feature for Three Houses, though, is battalions and gambits. Each unit can command a battalion, which provides a stat bonus and a special ability called a gambit. Gambits can range from AoE heals to attacks to big movement boosts. Between classes, skills, arts, and battalions, there's a lot to tinker with in Three Houses. Three Houses also has one of the most ambitious stories in the series, including 4 routes for you to play. And despite some stumbles, I think it's one of the more interesting stories in the series as well, and it's well supported by the strongest cast in the series. The routes are not all equally good or fleshed out in my opinion, but I enjoyed playing each of them. If you love reading supports and falling in love with characters, or are interested in some excellent world building, Three Houses is awesome. But if you're looking for a more balanced tactical experience, and you're not too interested in building a bunch of units from 0 to hero, then Three Houses might not be the best pick for you. Finally, we have our most recent entry in the series, Fire Emblem Engage, which has some of the best gameplay in the series and introduces a ton of novel new mechanics. The big one is the Emblem Rings, a series of swappable rings that provide the wearer with a big stat boost, a bunch of cool passive abilities, and a really strong active ability. These rings, combined with a very open reclassing system, means that every unit can mix and match classes and rings, continuing the trend of highly customizable units in Fire Emblem games. You can get almost any unit to do whatever you want. Want your slow strong unit to double? Slap Lyn on them. Want to warp your best combat unit? Hand them Celica. I've never had more fun planning team compositions than I have in Engage, and if unit and team building is something you enjoy, Engage is a great game to try. One nice thing about Engage is that while there is a ton of unit customizability, I find it less overwhelming than previous games, which all have a lot of slots for skills and abilities. In Engage, units just have 2 skill slots, so there's room for customization, but it's a little easier to wrap your head around. Engage also has some of the strongest map designs in the series. I like almost every map in the game, and there's really only 1 or 2 in Engage that I'm not huge on. It's also one of the more balanced games difficulty-wise. Normal is incredibly approachable, while Maddening is challenging without feeling unfair. If you're a fan of Fire Emblem gameplay, Engage is a must-play. The Emblem Rings are also each represented by a classic character from series history, so if you're a longtime fan of Fire Emblem in the market for a bit of a nostalgia hit, Engage can provide you that. If you like tactics gameplay, Engage is some of the best we've gotten from the series, and I highly recommend it. If you're more into the writing, Engage is a bit of a mixed bag. I find a lot of the cast to be extremely charming, but the main plot was one of the weaker stories in the series for me, despite having a few standout moments. Engage is the most recent Fire Emblem game, but there are also two more I want to touch on: Fire Emblem Heroes and Tokyo Mirage Sessions Sharp FE. I haven't actually played Heroes in years, and I haven't finished Tokyo Mirage Sessions yet. Fortunately, I know people who have. I had a chat with PK Gaming, who has played both games, to fill me in on how Heroes has changed since I stopped playing, and what they think about Tokyo Mirage Sessions. Let's start with FE Heroes, and I want to preface that this is a gacha game. It's designed to be addictive, and there's a heavy gambling component. Right off the bat, this means it's not a great choice for a lot of people. However, if you're okay with it being a gacha game, it has some things going for it. Fire Emblem Heroes brings in characters from all across the series for you to pull into your army, including seasonal alts for a lot of them. So if you've ever wanted to play as Xander in an Easter outfit wielding a carrot, this is the only place to do it. There's constantly new art releasing, as well as new lore or character interactions, so if you want more content from older Fire Emblem characters, Heroes might be able to provide you with that. Gameplay-wise, PvE Fire Emblem Heroes feels like a shrunk-down version of regular Fire Emblem. Maps are small and characters have less movement, but the weapon triangle skills and weapons will feel very familiar to fans of the series. The PvE is also easy enough that it's very doable on a free-to-play account. The game also features PvP, but if you aren't a paid player, it can be difficult to compete with the more powerful teams you may encounter. So if you're a free-to-play player, I might stick with PvE. Even if you just do PvE though, there's plenty of content and there's pretty much always something to be working towards, which if you're patient can keep you wanting to play more and work towards your goal. But if you aren't, it's also pressure to spend money on the game to speed up the grind, so your mileage may vary on whether that's a pro or a con. I would recommend Heroes mostly to people interested in seeing new lore and enjoying the art and voice lines of the various characters they pull, but if that doesn't appeal to you, or if you're concerned about the gambling aspect of Heroes, it might be a good one to skip. Last up, we have Tokyo Mirage Sessions Sharp FE, which is an odd little turn-based JRPG following a bunch of people trying to make their way in the entertainment industry. The characters form bonds with Fire Emblem characters and can use them to fight monsters as you progress through the game's dungeons. There are a lot of Fire Emblem references to be found, whether it be each character's partner in combat or Ileana working in one of the shops. But they mostly just feel like little references. A lot of Fire Emblem characters were brainwashed as well, so they may appear in the game, but they don't necessarily feel like the same character that you know and love. Still, the combat system here is a lot of fun. It encourages you to figure out and target enemies' weaknesses and make the best use of each character's abilities. Additionally, the dungeons are loaded with puzzles, most of which I have found pretty fun to figure out. Outside of dungeons, you can also advance the careers of each of your characters, so while your characters are getting better at fighting, they're also going from booking backup roles in the entertainment industry to becoming stars. Though this is a Fire Emblem crossover, I would mostly recommend it to JRPG fans. If you happen to like turn-based RPGs and Fire Emblem, you're probably going to enjoy this one, because it's a fun turn-based RPG with Fire Emblem references. But I wouldn't play it just for the Fire Emblem references. So that's all the Fire Emblem games I wanted to talk about. There are a few more like BS Acania and the Warriors games, but if you're just starting off with the series or finished 1 or 2 games, I hope this gives you a good idea on what Fire Emblem game might be good for you to play next. If you're not new to the series though, what's your favorite Fire Emblem game of the ones I mentioned here, and why? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you liked the video, consider giving it a like or subscribe so that you never miss an upload. There's also a community Discord you'll find linked in the video description if you want to chat about Fire Emblem, so check that out too if you're interested, and have yourself an awesome week.